Mini episode 1536 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.com.
The FDH Lounge. You'll want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge mini episode 1536. This is FDH Managing Partner Rick Morris here with you, and I have one of my fellow FDH Lounge original dignitaries with me today. One of our favorite FDH Lounge dignitaries, my good pal Chris Galloway, and we are breaking down the NFL. We are revisiting some things here at the 1/3 mark of the season. The one thing about the league's big money grab in 2021 of going to 18 weeks is that now you can actually do at the third point of the season here. There's no 17 weeks and it's the 64.2% part of the season. No, it's an even 1/3 here at this point, as we've seen 6 weeks come and go. Not all teams have played the 6 weeks because, again, the bye week started in week 6, but we're far enough along here. We have a substantial number of surprises. Maybe not the teams at the top, or at least two of the three. We'll talk about that. But structurally, this seems to be a weird time in the league right now as far as teams outside of the top tier, teams at the bottom of the league, and really all points in between. And just a weird, slushy, mushy kind of a feel to the start of the season here. Would you agree with that characterization, Chris Galloway?
Well, first let me say it's great to be here with you, Rick.
Thank you.
I would agree with that, and I guess that this is Roger Goodell's, that's his living fantasy, right? I mean, we've been told for years the league wants most of the league as close to 8-8 as they can get, or I guess now 9-7, and we're kind of seeing that. And at least this year we are. And I guess that makes everybody competitive. In some cases, it makes teams equally bad. You know, we have a few teams that are what we thought they were going to be, like Buffalo and Kansas City, holding up their end of the bargain. Certainly the Cowboys and the Eagles. Eagles better than what we expected, but still at the top. Minnesota leading their division. I didn't pick them there, but some did. And then we have the great disappointments. Tampa Bay, not looking good. New Orleans being what you and I kind of thought they were going to be, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And the Rams clearly have structural problems across that roster. And they do not look like a team that is going to, let alone compete for a Super Bowl. At least right now, they don't look like a team that's going to make the playoffs.
True.
So, so it's been an interesting year. And I would say that, every now and then we get this where there's a shift. We're all used to sort of the same teams for, 4 or 5 years being the competitive favorites. And then all of a sudden somebody else rises up out of nowhere. Seattle, the Giants, the Jets, Miami's playing well despite their quarterback problems. It seems like we might be entering into like a transition like that.
Here's the thing, though, and I'm going to compare and contrast this, and I don't think that this is a very favorable comparison for the NFL that I'm going to make, and that being recently on the show here when we did our NBA season preview, myself and FDH Lounge dignitary Ben Chu, this is a point that we've been talking about for the last year or two, is that the NBA is in the middle of something that you don't generally see, and that is it's a slow motion changing of the guard. You've got like 8 to 10 teams that are legitimate championship contenders in the NBA this year. Usually it's closer to 4 or 5, but you've got some of the kind of relics of the last era of Golden State and some teams like that. Toronto, even though they don't have Kawhi Leonard anymore, other than that, they're a lot the same team. And then you have other teams that are coming up right now. And you've got this thing where it's deeper. It's a deeper crop at the top than it generally is. And that is not a favorable comparison, I think, to the NFL, because it's a thing where things are a little bit mushier and it's a transition, but it is not leading to any kind of great depth at the top. It's just the opposite. You have three teams that have really separated themselves here. On the most recent FDH Lounge Power Rankings, we've got it as Philadelphia, Buffalo, Kansas City in that order. And then, as I've been joking with you off air, the second tier is like the Alaskan crabs right now. They've basically, it's like a billion crabs just disappearing in the sea. There is no second tier. We essentially skip right to the third tier because week after week, you and other people have been saying to me, oh, don't you have this team a little high in the top 10? To which my evergreen response is, well, who the hell else am I going to put there? That's where the NFL is right now, is that you have teams that you have to put in the top 10, unlike the NBA where teams belong in the top 10. In the NFL, it's like, well, there's nobody else to put here, I guess.
Well, what I would expect you to do then, Rick, in your next power ranking is I want to see your 1 through 5.
Okay.
And then I want to see 7 teams tied for 25th. And then 7 teams tied for 26th.
Basically,
that's really what you're talking about. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And there's nothing in the middle. So I think you should actually put that into action.
Well,
and we basically see 27 teams ranked 25th or lower.
Yeah, you might as well. I mean, because the way that it's going here, and we'll talk about some specific teams, but I think primarily we'll probably be looking at some of these structural issues because I think some of the macro level issues in the league this year are probably some of the more compelling angles. You have all of that. You have 3 teams that matter, a whole bunch else that don't. And by the way, every week at the FDH Lounge Multimedia Magazine, the fdhlounge.blogspot.com, that's where we've got the power rankings every week. But as far as it goes with the bottom of the league, that's a thing where outside of Washington and Carolina and Chicago and a handful of really execrable type teams, the bottom tier of the league is a thing where it doesn't feel like it's as bad as usual. I mean, I had to put Pittsburgh I think it was 30 a couple weeks ago, and then they go out and beat Tampa Bay the next week. Now, that's probably owing in large part to Tampa Bay being a fraud. I get that. But it's a thing where you have the bottom of the league. You very perceptively said to me early on when I had Atlanta ranked pretty low. You were like, Atlanta's going to be better than that, and they have ended up being. But at the time, I felt like I had no choice but to slot them in where I had them slotted in. And I said to you at the time, they're way better than the average. I think I might have had them number 32. I mean, they might be the best 32 ranked team of all time. Essentially, this is just a weird dynamic where, especially Carolina stripping it to the bone, the Christian McCaffrey trade late last night as we're taping this here, you do have 1 or 2 or 3 teams that are traditionally bad. But part of what's making this so weird is that the rest of the quote-unquote bottom feeders in the league are not maybe as horrible as they would generally seem to be.
No, I think you're onto something. I mean, the Bears haven't been good, right? But they're 2-4.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're still harder than you would have expected out.
Yes.
And certainly Atlanta at 3-3. To your point, even with their 3 losses, they've played hard, and each one of those losses come up just short.
Yes.
And so one could argue that 3-3, heck, they're close. They're a couple of plays from 5-1.
Right.
Which is remarkable. And so, yeah, I mean, that's where we're at. I mean, and you have a division like the NFC East where the Giants, we thought, Dable, good hire, but going to be a couple of years away from really turning that thing around. I guess coaching does matter.
Yes.
And I guess coaching still matters in a league like the NFL a lot more than a lot of fans, maybe want to acknowledge at times. Because the Giants, certainly on paper, have a talent deficit that they have somehow managed to make up with scheme and resolve and coaching. So, and I think you're seeing the same thing in New England.
Yes.
I was very down on the Patriots. Had them winning 6 games and Bill's job in trouble. Well, I mean, like Lee Corso likes to say, not so fast, my friend. That defense is playing phenomenally, and that's allowing them to establish their run game. They're doing, in large part, what the Browns wanted to do this year. Good defense, strong running game, and play action, and just and manage the clock. And they're doing it well. The Browns, on the other hand, that was the formula they wanted. They haven't figured out how to do it.
Well, it's a very interesting tale of two teams here, because I have to mention this, and this is something I had mentioned to you previously off air, that in doing the power rankings every week, I'm starting to look at some of the weekly numbers that are coming out at Pro Football Reference and their expanded standings that they have during the season. And I will freely admit, I don't understand what all the components are of the DSRS number, but it's the defensive component of the SRS. And of course, there's an offensive component to it as well. New England ranks on this advanced statistic number 1 defensively in the AFC. The Browns rank last in the AFC defensively. New England is a 7.4. The Browns are a minus 7.1. There are plus and minus numbers on these things here, and they average out to the regular SRS number. New England is underwater offensively at minus 2.5, but that 7.4 gives them an overall plus 4.9. Hence, that's why they're in my top 10, is that defensive ranking. And again, the Browns doing what they did. I will say this is one of these things where, on the surface, we look like a couple of silly gooses here, having spent as much time as we did breaking down the Browns roster here, talking about how good it was on paper. But again, I don't think we were wrong about that, although it is possible in all of this. I'm of the school of thought, sort of at least a little bit of a pox on everyone's house. I think it's very, very possible that Andrew Berry overrated some of these players in the draft, and certainly in free agency and everything. I think that's part of it. But the coaching has been the absolute drizzling shiznits. The players' execution has been the execution of these players leads me to that old quote from John McKay when he said back in the day, "The execution of my players, I'm in favor of it."
One of the great all-time lines.
Yes.
The Browns are like a microcosm of the NFL right now.
Aren't
right?
they?
Like,
they really are, Chris.
They've got on paper. You look at it and go, it's a talented roster. I mean, we went into this year, a lot of people thinking it was a top 5 roster.
I did too.
Sans the quarterback situation for the first 11 weeks.
I thought so.
And then you have a defense that finished the back half of last season as a top 5 unit. Can't figure out the difference between their ass and a hole in the ground. And basically with mostly the same players.
Right.
Which is what is just beyond mind-boggling to me. It's one thing for a unit to kind of start off slow, figure it out after a couple weeks, and really get into a roll. I mean, they're just going backwards. I mean, they have been bad and worse. And I don't understand. I don't understand it, because we've seen quality play out of that unit.
Yes.
And so it just doesn't make sense. And then listen. So you talk about the coaching. You can look at like some of the special teams miscues and defensive that cost them the Jets game. And I can be I was a big fan of the hire, an advocate for Stefanski. I still see a lot of good stuff that he does, but I find myself in the same spot like last year, where I wonder if, even though I think by and large he's called a good offense this year, I thought he's done a pretty good job, better than last year. And actually, the offense ranks pretty highly despite, having Jacoby Brissett at QB. So I can't really fault him for some of that. My coaching fault with Stefanski is that there are clearly times in game where I just feel like his face is so far into that big laminated menu that
the Waffle House menu.
He's failing at the game management, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's failing at critical decision making. We had that game famously where I said to you, kick the field goal, take the points. No, we'll never live to regret this. Was that the Atlanta game that you
Yes.
won?
Yes.
Yeah, and I just sat there banging on that point for the whole game, and then they ended up losing, and where that field goal would have made the difference. And so it's that, and then it's things like last week's game against New England. They get within 8 points, decides instead of kick the extra point, or rather 9 points, so rather than kick the extra point and make themselves down by 8, they go for 2, and now it becomes a 2-score game.
Right.
Which changes the whole dynamic of how you're going to try to manage the last bit of the game.
Right.
Which I thought was a mistake. And I was at the game, as you know, was screaming at the time, what are you doing?
Desperation. That's a desperation deal.
I guess it was, because I thought you're going to need to get them back. You're going to need to score a touchdown, and then you go for the 2 to bring it to overtime. You fail. Now you need 2 scores.
Right. Like
you've put yourself behind the 8 ball, and that's exactly what happened. And then like the decisions to when they got the ball back at the end of the first half, and they had a chance to drive down, and they let clock come off. He had 3 timeouts, and rather than calling a timeout at like 2:40 or 2:35, he basically lets 35 seconds go.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you could have taken the timeout, maybe run 2 plays, still had 2 timeouts left and a 2-minute warning. Like, you blew a bunch of time and really put yourself in a pickle when you didn't have to. And again, I can't help but think that kind of little stuff and what's going on with special teams and the lack of what we're seeing on defense, if we had a head coach that was focusing on all of it on Sunday, with his head on the overall strategy and overall everything that's going on, versus having his face buried in the Waffle House menu, like you say. I mean, when the Browns aren't on offense and there's anything going on, you can watch him. He's pacing back and forth with his face in that menu.
Right.
I'm sorry. He's not looking at what's the defense going. What are my defensive coaches saying? Is there anything I should be putting an eye on? What about this situation? You cannot tell me that the human brain can manage all that while you're sitting there trying to figure out your next series and how you might want to attack it. Like, I just think he's got himself. I think he has a good offense. I think he has a good offensive mind. But I think right now this team needs a head coach, and you can let Van Pelt call the game. Well, you get involved in every facet of it. Get on the headset and be listening to defensive calls and putting a critical eye on it.
Yep.
All of it. And I think that's the biggest problem right now in terms of coaching for the Browns. Besides, player execution on defense is dreadful. But I think the Browns are a perfect example of the NFL, where it's like, on paper it looked like this, and this is what we're getting. And it also shows you the way the Browns have lost games this year. For all of these teams in the league, you're reminded again of how close the margins are between winning and losing in the league.
Yes.
It's 1 or 2 plays every game make the difference, right? Whether for the Browns, whether it was the Jets and Atlanta, it's 1 or 2 plays. Same thing, Buccaneers, 1 or 2 plays against the Steelers. Again and again and again, every week, 1 or 2 plays. Same thing that's bit Baltimore in the rear, right?
Yeah.
With their collapses. It's 1 or 2 plays, then suddenly you've gone from the ability to win to now, we've lost. And the good teams will start to right the ship here in this next, quarter, third of the season, and start to separate themselves. But right now we have a lot of middling, like you pointed out.
Yeah, I mean, I do expect a second tier to reconstitute itself at some point, but who's to say if that takes 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks? This we don't know. We don't know how long that's going to take. And again, I think that talking about the Browns as we did here, I think that is a very excellent point. They are the microcosm of the league right now. I don't know if there's any Chinese menus that show that this is the year of the fraud, but right now it's been the year of the fraud in the NFL because there's a lot of fraud teams. I mean, Green Bay, Tampa Bay. Look, the Browns weren't going to be a top 10 team probably with Brissett in there anyways, but they shouldn't be as dog crap as they've been, so they count as a fraud. Baltimore does. So many teams do at this point in time, just really, and just having fallen apart in so many different ways. And one of the things here, we talked about this off air. I want you to make the point here and talk about this with the offense being declining, because clearly that ties into, that's going to exacerbate the trend of games being closer, one or two plays can decide games. That's going to be more likely to be the case when the games are lower scoring. But talk about that, and then I'm going to have a follow-up question once you do.
So, I mean, the point that I made you off the air was that despite the NFL's efforts to loosen up the defense, give advantages to the offense, everybody oohs and ahs about the passing attacks in the league now, and you hear constantly this drumbeat of you can't win in the NFL by running the football. It's that those days are gone. Well, I mean, the reality is right now, despite all of that, despite all the Air Coryell type offenses and the defenses having one arm tied behind their back in terms of rules by the league, scoring is down. Touchdowns per game are down, and it's clear that defenses in many ways have caught up again to how offenses want to play it, and the idea that you can't win in the league by running the football, I thought was proved sort of nonsense. Yes, they didn't win in the playoffs, but last year Tennessee was a number one seed in the AFC as the top running team. The Browns were inept at everything but running, and were still a competitive ball club. Baltimore, towards the top of the league in running, playoff type team. Now they didn't make it because of injuries, but you get what I'm saying is that this whole idea, Philadelphia, a running team, the Cowboys prefer to run to set up the pass. This whole idea that you can't, your run game is like, forget it. This narrative is just nonsense. But all that being said, it's, scoring is down despite all the league's efforts to drive it up. And there are some theories on to why that is. And I'd be curious to see what your thoughts are.
Well, I don't know that we have a big enough sample size yet on this. If we get to midseason or slightly thereafter, I think we could probably draw some more concrete thoughts on that here. I think, as you're saying, that defenses are, again, it's a long off season, right? These guys are just sitting there with their, I would say film projectors, but that would probably date me, whatever they're watching it on, their iPads or whatever, all through the off season, breaking things down.
Rick, have you learned nothing from the branding? It's their Microsoft Surfaces.
That's right. I still talk about this with people. One of the great things a couple of years ago was the NFL had a crackdown. They had to tell the announcers to stop calling them iPad knockoffs or whatever it was because Microsoft was complaining. But it was like, because that's what they were doing. They were referring to them essentially.
They're spending all that money with the league to have the announcers keep calling them iPads.
Yeah.
And I can understand their frustration. Tell your media partners to stop mislabeling our damn
or knockoffs.
Product.
Exactly, or knockoffs, which is even more insulting. But it's a thing where the defensive coordinators, again, there are Joe Woods notwithstanding, there's a lot of really good ones in the league, and they're spending the entirety of these off seasons trying to do their own version of the Manhattan Project and figure out how to stop these offenses. So I think that there is a little bit of that. I think defensive innovation is on the upswing to a degree, but this is something where, if you're asking me my opinion on this, and you were, I think the pendulum is going to swing back towards the middle a little bit as the season goes along, and offenses will probably flex themselves a little bit more, flex those muscles. Are you expecting the same, or do you expect this trend to continue?
I actually expect the trend to continue.
Okay.
And I think it's going to drive something, the next collective bargaining agreement, about how soft the practices in off season have become.
Right.
You see it with a loss of fundamentals.
Yes.
And again, this doesn't help defense, but the bad tackling that we see a lot now.
Yes.
You see, I think the other thing is, whether it's the coaching at college and then into the NFL, the teams that have good offensive line coaching and scheming seem to have a massive advantage.
Agreed.
I think the NFL right now is suffering from an offensive line problem.
Right.
I think if you watched that game with Denver and who they played the other night,
That was the Chargers. Yeah, that was hard to watch. That was hard on the eyeballs.
Yeah, I mean, that's just two bad offensive lines.
Yes.
Both quarterbacks running for their life constantly. Oh, Denver and L.A. Yeah.
Yes.
So, and again, LA's hurt with a couple of injuries on their offensive line.
Right.
I think that's the root of Tampa Bay's problems is their offensive line woes. And I think that's the league-wide problem right now is that they're just the offensive line play is just kind of shit and overall. And that affects the passing game. That affects the running game, and I think that's the biggest reason for scoring being down to a degree is that it's, if you're not protecting up front, everything else just falls apart.
Well, in looking at this, and this is what I wanted to ask you, is about if this ties in with some of the other things that we're looking at here, some of the macro trends for this year. When you talk about the vanishing, the extinct second tier in the league right now, the fact that other than the very, very worst teams in the league, maybe 30, 31, 32, 23 to 29, I think on average is significantly better than it would be most other years. So this whole kind of prolonged kind of mushy middle throughout the league. I could be mean to you and call it the Mitt Romneyization of the NFL, but we'll find another exemplification for the mushy middle. But as far as it goes,
I mean, it's not going to offend me. I'm not a middle-aged woman. I mean, I'm not.
I'm just going back in the archives here, busting your balls on some previous conversations we've had. But no, that mushy middle that's out there, do you think that ties directly into the lower scoring? And I'm not talking about the chicken and the egg here, but as far as that there's a mushy middle that's being caused by that causation and whatever. But I think generally speaking, when you're looking at lower scoring games that are more prone to be decided by one or two plays where a game structure where defense is carrying a bigger level of import than it has the last couple of years. I think that could lead to the mushification that we've seen here and some of the surprises, primarily the bad surprises from the fraud teams. But like I said, the second worst level of teams in the league being a little better than you would expect this year. Do you think that the scoring being down ties into all of this?
Oh, I absolutely do.
Okay.
And I think that ties directly to the offensive line play.
Mm-hmm.
Because you look at, there's a lot of these teams that you're throwing at the bottom of the pile, right? Rightfully so.
Sure. But
you look at their offensive weapons and you go, why are they so bad?
Right.
Like, it doesn't make sense. And then it's like, let's start dissecting their line play, And then I think that like Indianapolis, for example, they've had bad line play this year in front of Matt Ryan, by and large.
Right.
And it's one of the reasons he's struggled. It's one of the reasons he struggled a lot down the stretch in Atlanta in his last couple of years because that line was atrocious. If your teams, I think you've got to step back and figure out how you're going to address the line issue in terms of your drafting and development. Ironically, that's probably the one area that the Browns have done very well.
Yes.
They've drafted, they've acquired and developed and coached and then signed their talent, right? By holding on to Bitonio and Teller and bringing in a Nick Harris and he was looking good and then boom, got hurt,
Right.
Ethan Posick has come right in and been very good, I think, so far this year at center.
Right.
And again, he was a guy I was high on out of LSU and then just sort of disappeared in Seattle. But all that being said, they went out and got Conklin. They have invested massively on their line.
Yes.
Where a lot of teams haven't. They've tried to just kind of get by.
Right.
And again, I think that's you get one or two injuries. If you don't have depth, you're toast. So I think it's all. I think what you've outlined, Rick, is it's all symbiotic. It's all interrelated, and it's certainly affecting the quality of play, points scored. The ability to sort of clearly understand the tiers within the league. You've got three teams and then basically everybody else.
I'm thinking also, too, something that is symbiotic in the same way is having mentioned a couple of these guys here during the course of the show. If you want to use them for poster children, if you will, you've got Stefanski and Woods with the Browns. When you talk about coaching there, Daboll with the Giants and overcoming the atrocity that remains Danny Dimes to be 5-1 here at this point. It seems to me that, and again, I think you touched on it a little bit before with Belichick too, and you'd kind of said this with Daboll as well, but I think way more than usual, I think coaching is determining the outcome of some of these games here. Not that it's not always important, but it's a thing where coaching primarily, it seems like, has been of the most importance as far as taking teams over the top, getting them to places far beyond where they would be otherwise in January and February. But it seems like in the early part of the season here that we're seeing, again, whether it be Arthur Smith, whether it be Daboll, guys who haven't been handed a very good hand at this point in time. Even Saleh with the Jets here, with them being 4-2. It seems like coaching through the first third of the season, whether it's a little bit or a lot, has been more important than it has been at the outset of previous seasons. Do you see the same thing?
I absolutely do, and here's what I think that goes again back to. Okay, shortened light lifting off season.
Yes,
limited amount of times that guys can spend with coaches and with a playbook, and how much time they can be in the building. All the collective bargaining restrictions that the players have demanded has not made the game better.
Right.
And I think what happens is that teams that are well coached are getting off to a better start than those that maybe have a lot of talent with average coaching, that it's going to take them longer. And I think that so because of the lack of time and everything else and film and yada yada yada, I think you've hit on it. Is that the good coaching will give you a leg up at the beginning of the year. Remember, Belichick used to famously talk about he doesn't care about the first month.
Right.
That's when he's trying to figure out his team.
Right.
And he's trying to, it's like that on steroids now, right? Like
right.
The good coaches now have a huge leg up over the Cliff Kingsburys of the world because Bill Belichick has, he's got a grasp of what his team is. He's got experience. He's just got a huge leg up on taking an inexperienced group and getting them to do what he wants in the beginning of the season faster. Now, the flip side to that is, Rick, once other teams start to catch up, my expectation is teams like the Giants will start to fade.
Yes.
Now, they still may fade their way into a wild card into the playoffs.
Right.
But the Giants are a team that I keep looking at going, eventually talent does matter. Eventually these other things, and that is a team without any depth and without a lot of talent. And I think to myself, great coaching and scheming has gotten them to this point, and then it's like, are the other teams going to start to figure some stuff out? And then the Giants, will lose a few of those games that they've won, and they start to fade a little bit. They're to me a prime candidate for the fade.
Yes.
For the second half fade.
I agree with that. And their old defensive coordinator back in the day turned Super Bowl nemesis, Bill Belichick, who we've been talking about here. Again, for the better part of the first 20 years of the 21st century, he was the model of coach. Everyone seemed to be looking at, like, we got to go try and get a guy like Belichick that can scheme and figure things out. And then somewhere along the way, the last couple of years, the prototype became Sean McVay. And, hey, let's get a young guy with a faux hawk to come in here, and it's in his 30s, and be our head coach. And
well, I think it's more than a faux hawk, Rich. I mean, McVay clearly knows how to coach and scheme.
Right.
I don't think the Rams won a Super Bowl on the power of a faux hawk.
I mean, I'm not, and I don't even believe McVay doesn't even have one. But I'm being my typical facetious self and making my point.
I get your point. Here's the 32-year-old wonder kid. Right?
Yes.
But your Dolphins are benefiting from.
Yes, that. McDaniel. Yes, you got to love that. Although
and I think that. Well, this, McDaniel to me goes back to, you and I had a conversation many, 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 many moons ago.
Yeah.
About coaching in the NFL and where I think it's going, and we talked about, and I talked about the old adage of GMs. We was sort of talking about the new generation and analytics and everything.
Right.
And I had said to you, you talked about pedigree, you know?
Yeah.
The guys that have, the family, and your dad was a coach, and I, my opinion on that was that's all just a bunch of hogwash. That now in the future you can start to see guys like McDaniel. Now we are seeing young guys that are wicked smart that probably ought to be doing engineering at MIT are applying themselves to football versus the old school knuckle draggers that are like, you got to do this and, spit your chaw on the field. And, that's out. These guys are complex. They are these guys in any other capacity would be successful, whether they were investment bankers, hedge fund guys, you name it. And because these are smart analytical guys you're now starting to see roll into the league and applying those skill sets to how they coach. I mean, the discussion about McDaniel when he was with the Browns, this wide receiver coach. Did you see the interview with, I think it was Hawkins?
Yes, on the Rick Eisen show.
Talking about how he was his favorite coach ever.
Yes.
Because he wanted to, he showed him tape, not of football, but Allen Iverson in his crossover.
Yes.
And he applied that to running a route and getting, and I thought to myself, you would have never seen that from the old school, quote unquote, pedigree coach. Right. But there's a guy who's just smart. And that's the kind of guy that's coming into the league now. That these guys didn't necessarily play football, or maybe they just played some low level college football. So they understand the basics of the game. But then there are guys that probably ought to be working on Wall Street or, designing the next great, automobile or something, but instead they're doing football. And I think that those guys like McDaniel now going forward get a huge leg up in an environment where players aren't spending much time with coaches anymore. They don't have much of an off season. They don't tackle. They don't do anything, right? Right. So if you're, the smarter guys, I think are going to get off to hotter starts.
Well, sure. And I've got a larger point to make about McVay as we start to bring this full circle, but I'm going to put a thumbtack in that for a minute because I want to follow up on McDaniel here in this point, is that I feel like, and this is where in the FDH Lounge where nothing is off topic, where we can do cross-pollination on all kinds of different subjects, you being the chief futurist of the FDH Lounge, I think you're going to agree with what I'm going to say, that Mike McDaniel is a product of his age. This is the information age. We have never, as human beings, had more information right at our fingertips. And I go back to, somebody made the point a couple of years ago, and I think this is the best exemplification of that. And the fact that Mad Men went off the air, I think, in 2015 or so, and smartphones have only gotten appreciably better and stronger since then. But in the final season, I don't know if you ever watched Mad Men, but spoiler alert.
Not.
Okay, so great show. Spoiler alert, there was a scene, the agency had a supercomputer in the one room. This was set in like 1970, 1971. And it took up basically like an entire room in the office there. And it was to process all these different types of things about advertising and where to put your money and everything like that. And I remember some TV critic making the point that these actors on set, when they go to their dressing rooms, they're leaving behind in there, when they go on set, they're leaving behind a smartphone that is several times, maybe many times, maybe millions of times more powerful than that supercomputer from 1970 that's being depicted in that scene. And
correct,
that's where we are. And Mike McDaniel, he is an open-minded kind of a guy, an inquisitive kind of a guy, and he is taking advantage of this information age. The fact that we as people, whatever endeavors we're doing, you want to know how to do this, how to go do this. People have you can have a hobby on just about anything because you go on to WikiHow and you learn how to do it. Mike McDaniel, I think, exemplifies this day and age we live in, and that's why I love having him as coach for the Dolphins, because it makes him capable of doing the kind of things you're talking about.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, the perfect example would be, obviously out of the league now, but all right, I'll use somebody in the league now. Lovie Smith is that supercomputer from the show.
Yes.
All right, and then Mike McDaniel is your iPhone 12.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's what you got.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why, you know, the hiring of him down in Houston was a head scratcher.
Yes.
Was just a horrible head scratcher. Didn't make any sense. And so, and again, unless it was just a PR thing, like, hey, we kind of just bullied our former African-American quarterback, and hey, our owner might just be a racist, so we might want to make a change.
Right.
Hire this guy so when we fire him in 2 years, when we finally have talent on the team and we go hire a Mike McDaniel type of guy, we don't look so bad. I have a suspicion that's the silly thought process there.
Yeah, I think so. He's a placeholder.
I mean, I don't mean to be, you know, terribly cynical, but okay, I will be.
No, he's a placeholder. He is.
But the funny thing about it is, why go do that when they basically already had that with the previous coach?
Yes. We're going to replace a placeholder with a placeholder.
Yeah, that's what I didn't understand. And the previous coach had done a pretty decent job of getting them to play hard.
Yes.
So I didn't understand the whole, like, you're out and we're bringing in a guy who's probably worse than you. Like what?
Well, right. Right. And so, that's, you know.
So anyway, not to get off on a tangent about the Texans, but to your point, you've nailed it right there. Right?
Okay.
Like, we are in a new era, and the next wave of coaches are going to be guys that, I'm waiting for the guys that write their own algorithms and stuff, you know.
Ooh.
Well, like the coaches that are programming their own AI to figure shit out.
Oh,
man.
I
once told you a few years ago, hey, you're figuring out quarterbacks. Well, why has no team yet figured out, like, hey, we want to test how fast your brain synapses fire? You know, because we find if yours fires at, our studies show if yours fires at 0.04 or less or lower, like you're a better quarterback. So you make decisions quicker. If you're 0.5 and up, to 0.1 or 0.5 to 0.1, you're slower at making processing decisions. And therefore, our numbers show that, I'm waiting for a team to get to that literally neurological level.
Wow.
And nobody's actually crossed that bridge yet, right? But,
right.
Throw the Wonderlic away. I want to know how fast your little neurons fire.
Wow.
And no one's gotten to that point yet. But don't you feel like at some point, like, that's coming?
I mean, yeah. Everybody keeps talking about sports science. Why not sports science above the shoulders? I mean, and that's where I wish I had a better Cosmo Kramer impression, because I would give you you just blew my mind.
But yeah, so the league, I think what we're seeing is, what I worry is that the league will ham-fistedly try to adjust rules again.
Right.
Rather than address the fact that these players aren't getting enough coaching, there's bad offensive line play, and that's affecting their product.
Right.
Now, all that being said, the NFL's never been more popular.
Yeah.
I don't think the average fan is really caught up in the fact that there's, one less touchdown per game. The ratings are through the roof on all these different platforms that they're now into.
Right.
You've got gambling coming, online legally across the country, which is only going to just massively inflate the NFL's revenue. You could make an argument of if it's not really broken in terms of the revenue, why mess with it?
Well, but I think, offense does, I think it will lead to better ratings yet still. I think they'll look at it that way. The NFL never rests on its laurels. I think they get excessively greedy on a lot of stuff. And in that way, it will be a thing of like, well, if we're making this much money now, think about if the numbers were back up again on the field. Which leads me to my last point here that I was going to make, and this goes back to Sean McVay. Of all the ways where he has been a sort of Pied Piper for the league the last couple of years, one where I think it has had a very deleterious effect, and we've touched on it briefly here, but I mean, Sean McVay basically was the one that really sort of trumpeted and really kind of brought into whole focus here the whole thing of like, well, August doesn't really matter. It's a copycat kind of a league, and I always associate him with the movement to basically just like, well, we're just going to hold a whole bunch of guys out of our preseason games. And that leads to the lack of cohesion early in the season.
Well, you're right about that. I mean, I think, McVay has his theory. And listen, every coach is worried about injuries and things like that.
Right.
And that's clearly his driving force.
Right.
But, there has to be a balance. And I think coaches that pendulum always swings, right?
Right.
And I think coaches are trying to figure that out. Now there's one less preseason game. I think that they're kind of trying to sort of, you're going to start to see these guys swinging back. Maybe the starters now playing in the third game, to try to get them up to speed a little bit before that first game of the season.
Mm-hmm.
So the pendulum swings. I wouldn't be surprised if you see more teams, because of these slow starts and these struggles, start to say, you know what, we gotta actually do a little bit more in the preseason than what we've been doing on the field. All that said, the other thing is that, there are some people out there saying, look, these injuries are occurring because these guys don't tackle in practice. They
Right.
don't do all these things, right? And so they're softer than ever, quote unquote softer than ever. And so when they go and play a game, the violent game at full speed, they're just not holding up.
Right.
And there's probably some truth to that as well. And so it's going to continuously be this balance of the pendulum, right? Like trying to strike the right balance. And we're seeing a little bit of a swing right now in the league. We've got a lot of mediocrity in terms of the middle, the lack of a strong middle of the league in terms of accomplishment. And it'll be interesting to see if it all sort of shifts and pans out and averages out over the rest of the season.
It will. And just in terms of looking at this here, in all the different ways that the season has defied and mystified our expectations and really left us puzzled at some of the things we've seen in terms of, again, I always tend to be, as I relentlessly say on the show, a student of the odds. And I'm always kind of a believer in things kind of the progression to the mean, the regression to the mean, whatever. So in terms of big, medium, or small, in terms of regression to the mean, on any number of these trends, in terms of the fraud teams stopping being frauds and kind of getting their act together here, scoring going up a little bit more, and that would probably, again, as we said, sort of exacerbate that trend as far as some of the teams that we expected to be up there being up there again, because particularly it's the offenses being not so great at times in places like Green Bay. We didn't expect that, even though we probably should have when we looked at their wide receiver core. But in terms of regression to the mean and things getting to be a little bit closer to what we expected as the season goes along, I'm going to ask you big, middle, or small. I'm going to say middle sort of regression to the mean in a number of these areas. And that would mean also teams like the New York Giants going back to the pack as well.
I'm going to go small. I think by and large, you're not going to fix some of the structural problems that you're seeing because of things like offensive line play. I think you're going to see a couple teams regress to the mean. But I think that, I think the Packers are what they are this year. They're going to be a 9-8, 8-9 team. I think the AFC North, other than the Bengals maybe breaking out with like a 4 or 5 game win streak, which I could see them doing with that schedule.
Yes.
I think the Steelers continue to sink to the bottom.
Yes.
I think the Browns are going to continue to sink to the bottom,
and
I think the Ravens are going to continue to muddle along at 500.
Right.
I suspect the Bengals are going to separate.
I do too.
So I think there's going to be a few of that. So I'm saying small, but maybe it really is medium. Let's put it this way. I'm going to call it medium. How's that?
In honor of your favorite coach, Dan Campbell, and his T-shirts.
Correct.
Everything ties together. It really does.
There's a guy that needs to glide up to reach my expectations of that.
That's right. And, we shall see how that goes. Again, though, and early on, this was really the case. I mean, their record is right about what I would have thought it would have been. But I will grant you said they were going to be more competitive this year, and that really has been the case. But it gets harder and harder to focus on that as the season goes along because the record is just so execrable at this point.
Well, that they're another team that just is losing games by 1 or 2 plays.
Yes,
and that was the case for them last year.
Right.
And it's, you look at them and you go, man, at some point you've got to start winning some of those.
Right.
You've got to start closing out, or a guy like him, his job will be in jeopardy. Because the yay, rah, rah, I like to eat kneecaps and everything, we all understand it only has a shelf life of only so long.
Right.
But the Detroit offense has been very good. Well, other than that stinker against New England.
Right.
Their offense has been very good. Their defense has been terrible, which is what's held them back. But, that's a team that I'm just like, man, one or 2 plays every game, and they could literally be 4-2. They just can't seem to close it out.
Here's the funny thing.
But again, I would also say this at this point. Even though I would like them to improve and finish that 9-8 that I predicted, chances are they're gonna end up finishing with 4 or 5 wins. They're gonna continue to slide the way they are showing us what they are, a bad defensive team. If they get some injuries on their wideouts and their weapons, they're toast.
It looks like that, but here's the thing, though, is that, again, if not for some of the other things happening in the league this year, he could make a persuasive point, because you and I have talked about this, especially defensively, how riddled with holes this roster still is. So this is a thing where if this guy loses his job, the first thing he's going to go do is get a voodoo doll of Brian Daboll, because that Brian Daboll blows up his case, because on the surface he could make the case and say, losing narrowly, what more do you expect me to do with this roster? But then you see what Daboll's doing, and it's like, oh, there really is a higher ceiling that's possible.
Well, it's true, and I guess he should be spending some time looking at what Daboll's doing. I guess. Because what he's doing has been absolutely miraculous. Even though I expect them to slide some.
Yes.
But still, first year out of the gate, wow.
Yeah, well, it really has been incredible, and part of a head-spinning first third of the NFL season. So I'm glad that we were able to come on here, as I fully expected, and be able to make some sense out of a lot of the chaos that's going on here. Very proud of the way we were able to do so. So thank you, as always, Chris Galloway. Appreciate it.
Hey, anytime. Love to come on.
Love having you on, buddy, for breakdowns just like this one, and we will do so as this football year continues to unfold. Thank you, my friend, and thank you, everybody, for joining us.